California, from its origin as an American state, was premised on this notion of a gold rush, of instant transformation, of opportunity, of if I can go to this place, my life might be better off. You see this period of utopian settlements, of new agricultural communities, almost this kind of startup society energy that says California had long since become one of the prisms through which the American people, for better and for worse, could glimpse their future. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the California Future Society podcast. This week, I have an episode that I've been chewing on for a long time now, and it's the evolution of the California dream. This is something I've been thinking about because, selfishly, for my own life, my own thinking, my own writing, my own work, I've been wanting to have a better understanding of where the state is going. And I don't think I'm alone. I think a lot of Californians feel this way. They feel a sense of loss or uncertainty, or maybe the best way to put it is that the story and the narrative that we tell ourselves about the state no longer rings true for a lot of people. We'll get into that, of why that is, and what pieces are perhaps most out of sync with reality. But I think anytime you're in a situation where the narrative you tell yourself about, whether it's yourself or your family or your career or the place you live in or your city, or in this case, your state, no longer rings true, you're forced to come up with a new narrative, to come up with a new story and a new sense of direction and purpose about who you are and where you're heading. We'll get into some of the more specifics throughout this episode. My goal is to go through the history of the state as concise as possible and have an understanding of what the dream has looked like through California's evolution, so that by the end, we can have at least some semblance of a foundation to think about, where is the state heading? What is the future of the state going to look like? And what does it take to get Californians dreaming again? Obviously, this is a massive topic. This is something that I feel a little bit crazy trying to bite this off all in one episode. So you'll have to let me know how you feel like I did at the end. There's going to be entire chapters and sections of the state that just get completely left out. And that's just the way it is. Unless you wanted me to sit here and record for, 12 hours, like I'm Dan Carlin, covering all the intricacies in his hardcore history episodes of, a certain war campaign. It's too much. So it's a massive topic. So in order to try and cover it as concisely as possible in a single episode, I lean on my friend Kevin Starr, which, if you're watching the video, you can see me holding up his book series on the California Dream. You can see there's 8 books here. It's over 3,000 pages in total. And it's all based around California history, different chapters of the state's history, united by this idea of the California Dream being the central kind of narrative structure for understanding what the state is and where it's going. Just a quick read of some of his titles are, Material Dreams, Inventing the Dream, Endangered Dreams, Golden Dreams, Embattled Dreams, The Dream Endures, California on the Edge, Coast of Dreams. Set those down. So I've read all those books. They're incredible. If you care about California history and you want to understand the state better, by far and away, Kevin Starr is the place to start. He was a 7th generation Californian, born in 1940. He pretty much spent his entire life, his entire career, chronicling California, understanding the state, and documenting it, which I think is really cool, just regardless of the topic. For anyone who has a degree of focus and passion about a specific thing, to then spend their entire life dedicated to understanding it more, I think there's a lot of beauty in a life lived that way. And he's really good at blending not just the economic and political analysis, but also some of these cultural ideas. He's really into cultural history. And like I said, he talks about the dream and how it evolves through history. So my goal is, to the extent possible, and for my own purposes, I'm not trying to give a one-for-one breakdown of here's how Kevin Starr thinks about where we are today in California. He's passed away. But his books are far and away the best resources for understanding California. So I'm going to lean on them heavily. And I'm going to quote specifically, I'm going to quote from this book, California in History, which was his shorter version, kind of single volume, 300-page book summarizing state history. If I quote from him, that's the book I'm quoting from. Which, just as a side note, if any of you care about California history, you want a single volume place to start, and biting off 3,000 pages across 8 books sounds intimidating, that California in History by Kevin Starr is far and away the best single volume history of California that I've ever come across. Okay, So the way I'm going to structure this episode is by going through with painting with a really broad brush, think through the major chapters of the state's history, and then ending on just a conversation about where California is today. And the reason I think this matters, just as a starting point, is by recognizing that the California dream is bigger than just California. Okay, I'm going to say that again. The California dream is bigger than just California. So what do I mean by that? Well, there's a famous quote from Wallace Stegner saying that California is like the rest of the United States, only more so. California is like the rest of the United States, only more so. Meaning that California is this concentrated dose of the American identity, that California's strengths and its weaknesses embody the American ideals, the American personality. And so, while I come at this conversation and about thinking about the California dream, specifically concerned about the state and the state's trajectory, I think it's important to know that in trying to understand California better, you understand America better. And there's a quote from Kevin Starr in that book that he talks about how California remains an American place, perhaps the most American of American places, prophesying the growing diversity of the United States. And he says California had long since become one of the prisms through which the American people, for better and for worse, could glimpse their future. A friend of mine, a former professor of mine, she once traveled to East Asia, stopped in cities like Singapore, Hong Kong, and Shanghai. And she came back and she said, I feel like I've seen the future, right? These are some of the latest and greatest cities with clean, modern, exciting infrastructure, LED lights all across the sky. She said it felt like I was in the future and seeing what cities around the world could look like down the road. For most of California's history, California has been that place where people arrived and they came to and they said, I've seen the future. Or if you were an American or from around the world and you wanted to seek opportunity, you wanted to seek out what the future could look like, California was the place that you came to see it. I think that's a good place to start as a foundation. And then, like I said, we're going to go through history. So to start, we're going to talk through this first period, right? Calling it the dream is born, 1850 to roughly 1900 or so. And why 1850, right? 1849, that is the gold rush. That is when California surges into its American identity relatively soon after the Mexican-American War, where California becomes American territory, American land rather, and then it becomes a state very quickly. Kevin Starr writes, the very acceleration of California into an American Commonwealth had been the result of a gold rush, with all that such beginnings implied. For the perception of California as a place where, note this part, where human beings might break through the constraints of day-to-day life and come into possession of something immeasurably better. Right? California, from its origin as an American state, was premised on this notion of a gold rush, premised on this notion of instant transformation, of opportunity, of if I can go to this place, my life might be better off. Even in just a purely material sense of I might be able to strike gold in these early days. So from the very beginning, California clicks into the American imagination. It shows up on the scene as this place of instant transformation and opportunity. And another quote, just to give you a sense of the pace of how quickly things transformed in California following the gold rush. Within the following 2 years, the gold rush fast-forwarded California into what historian Hubert Bancroft would later describe as a rapid monstrosity maturity. By 1849, the non-Native American population of California was approaching 100,000 people, up from less than 10,000 people just the year before. Even more astonishingly, California had organized itself as a state, bypassing territorial status, and had held elections and was petitioning Congress for admission into the Union. Within 3 years of President Polk's announcement, the non-Native American population had soared to 255,000 people, and a new metropolis, San Francisco, had sprung into existence like Atlantis rising from the sea. And just a few decades later, Kevin Starr writes that by 1870, San Francisco, with a population of over 149,000 people, was the 10th largest city in the United States, a remarkable development for a city that did not formally exist in 1846. So California shows up out of nowhere. and it bypasses territorial status like they know because so many people surge in and it becomes a state, even though the surrounding land in the American West had not yet achieved statehood. That's what leads to what some historians call the idea of one historical book on California that I love. It's titled California, an Island in the Land. Right? California is developing in relative isolation, and it arrives with this air of mystery and excitement for the American people. Kevin Starr, when he's talking about the land itself, he talks about California was a kind of island sealed off by the Pacific, the Sierra Nevada, the Klamath and Cascade Ranges in the north, and the Mojave Desert in the southeast. Our natural landscapes and our intense natural beauty somewhat shielded the state from the rest of the country. So California is this far off mythical place. And like I said, at the very beginning, the dream of California was one of risk and reward. So a gold rush is not for everyone. If you're established, if you are someone who has a well-established life on the East Coast, you're not going to uproot and take a boat or ride across the country to try and get to California to seek gold. Who seeks gold? It's the opportunists, it's the strivers, it's the people who feel like they've been left out, and have a high risk tolerance, and are in pursuit of a better life. Kevin Starr writes about this. He calls it a rush, a mass migration of mainly younger men and some of middle age from all corners of the earth, including China and Australia, who ventured everything, their lives included, as 1 in 12 would die in the process, on the gamble that they could strike it rich and thereby break to a better life. Such a hope, such a psychology of expectation fused the Californian experience irretrievably onto a dream of better days, of a sudden, almost magical transformation of the ordinary. So these are the people who are showing up to California early on. And that shapes the state and the expectations that people have of the state. I don't have time to go into all the details, but it was horrifically violent. The murder rate, and it wasn't just for the people who came here, it was also for the native population. There's a whole story there. Roughly I was reading, 1/3 of the native population was estimated upon Columbus's arrival lived in the broader California area. And native population is nearly extinct by 1870. Now, a lot of that happened under the Spanish system, the Spanish mission era before that, but it was also accelerated during this time, even though a lot of the deaths had already happened during this gold rush era, this, like I said, for better and for worse, this American impulse to control the land. And so, again, I don't have time to go into that. But in addition to the gold rush, I think another core pillar of the California dream at this time was one of an experimentation and a relative blank slate. Right? California was this massive land. A lot of it was not inhabited after 90% of the native population had died by something like 1850 or something like that. And so you see this time period of utopian settlements, of new agricultural communities, almost this kind of startup society energy happening where people from across the country, from across the world show up and say, we're going to start a new city, we're going to start a new town, we're going to start a new community. A lot of them were affiliated around different religious communities or social groups. Some were secular or even just agricultural communities, like my hometown, Upland, which was part of the Ontario Water Colony Project at the time. George Chafee and his brother, they just said, hey, we can figure out how to get water here. And so anyone can come buy a little plot of land. They buy into the water system, and then they're able to grow citrus and other produce and set up new life. And I think that is also a core part of this early part of California history, the California dream. It's a place where you can experiment, where there's not an existing social structure and you have to climb the existing ladder, right? I use the phrase startup society intentionally, right? People join startups because startups represent opportunity, not only for growth, but also for greater responsibility than you might get in an existing company. Right? When you're working at a massive company, a corporation, you have to climb the ladder. You have to pay your dues. Even if you're a hot shot, if you're in a massive firm like a Goldman Sachs or something like that, you can climb the ladder quickly, but it still is going to take some time. Versus if you're in a startup and you show up and you're an incredible engineer from day one, you can very quickly become the CTO, right? You can be a 25-year-old CTO when the CEO themselves is only, let's say, 26 years old, right? There's more opportunity for upward growth. And beyond the gold rush, California continued to develop through these booms and busts that promised people opportunity and new ways of living. Kevin Starr writes, not for California, there would be, nor would there ever be, as it turned out, a deliberate process of development. California would rather develop impetuously through booms of people and abrupt releases of energy. These abrupt releases of energy, new people showing up, new people hoping that there's new opportunity. So that's, I think, the core pillar. If you can only take one thing away from this early chapter of California, what is it? It's this idea of this gold rush hope for the future of the state. Now, I've hinted at it in a few ways, but there's also this fundamental question of the time that continues to show up throughout the state and is continuing, it's still a discussion today of who exactly gets to participate in the dream, right? When a place offers opportunity and it offers wealth and instant transformation, everyone wants a piece of that. And because of that, you then get challenges, especially during the hard times, of who you allow to participate in the dream. So we'll talk about more of this later and how different, racial minorities were treated. But you can even see this in the beginning, right? When it's talking about the railroad, Kevin Starr writes about how throughout its history, American California has always imported its labor when necessary. So specifically talking about the railroad, he says there's not enough men in California willing to do this sort of back-breaking work at the price that the railroad owners were willing to pay. Serving the labor pool of California, Crocker, the person who's running the railroad, could see that there is thousands of Chinese in the state, most of whom had, for reasons of racial exclusion, been marginalized out of mainstream employment. He would eventually have some 10,000 in his employ, and cumulatively, over the next 4 years, the Chinese workers would achieve an epic of construction second only to the Great Wall of China itself. So I think this is important. I'm not going to go into all the details about the railroad and the Chinese population there, but we see in California history this repeated pattern of opportunity, of new people pursuing that opportunity, and people surging in to take part in the dream and then facing some type of exclusion along the way as a result. So here we see this intentional cultivation of Chinese labor. Later on, there would be different laws prohibiting Chinese immigration to the state. We'll talk about this more in the 1930s, but you saw whether it was different ethnic groups within America or from around the world, people surging into California, seeking opportunity and growth, and then later facing some type of restriction or some type of challenge. And I raise this just because I think it's an important part of the California dream as well. We're in a moment in national history, 2025, of debates around immigration and who is American and what does this look like. And I think these battles have always been fought in California first and foremost. And you see that. So I just wanted to note that. We'll touch on that a little bit more later on. So by the end of this chapter, right, wrapping up this early chapter of roughly 1850 to roughly 1900, California has this surge, this influx of people and energy, but it still is largely empty. Around this time, Kevin starts writing that California was, for all practical purposes, empty. Larger than Great Britain, Holland, Belgium, Denmark, and Greece combined, the state did not contain the population of even a third-ranked modern city. So the California dream at this time is still one of opportunity and excitement, but it still has yet to evolve into the California that we would know later on. So that moves us into then part 2, 1900 to, let's call it up to the World War II, 1940s. One of a time of industry, imagination, and infrastructure. It's almost like a time of California kind of being like a teenager. It's coming into its own. It's starting to develop more traits, and the California dream is starting to take more shape, but it's still not yet fully developed in the way that we know it today. Okay, so a checkpoint at this time in California's population. Kevin Starr writes that at the 20th century dawn, the population of California stood at roughly 1.5 million people, quite a small figure for such a vast state. Nearly half this population was living in the San Francisco Bay Area, with San Diego, with a population slightly under 18,000, remaining a venerable but inconsiderable settlement, and Los Angeles barely passing the 100,000 person mark. Across the next decade, the interurban electric big red cars of the Pacific Electric Railway, incorporated in 1901, would connect the city of Los Angeles to most of the cities and towns in the Los Angeles plain, transforming Los Angeles into the hub of Southern California with a population of 319,000 by 1910, right? It's almost tripling over a decade. And in addition, not to leave out San Francisco and my friends up north, there's another quote that's saying that by the early 1900s, San Francisco had a higher proportion of foreign born residents relative to its total population than any other city in the United States, including New York. Anyways, okay, so at this point in California history, San Francisco is established, the foundation has been laid, and the city is this global hub thanks to the boom of the gold rush. And Southern California is starting to chug along. It's starting to catch up, but it still has a long ways to go. And the most notable part about this switch from the pre 1900s to this early 1900s is that along the way in the late 19th century, California builds the railroad to the rest of the country. So, what is the California dream at this time? It's this idea of boosterism, particularly in Southern California, but it's boosterism being, these real estate developers who are trying to hype up the rest of the country, convince them and persuade them through marketing and advertising campaigns that you need to move to California because this is where the opportunity is. So this already was happening during the gold rush, but that quickly fizzled out as the opportunity was taken. And so the foundation of the California dream was already laid, right? It's this place of opportunity. It's this place where you can have instant transformation, create wealth, seek out opportunity. And now they pour gasoline onto that fire. And they specifically target people who they think could come and buy the land, primarily in Southern California, but elsewhere in the state as well, and get their slice of the good life. There's this poster that I'll pull up that I love from this era. It's very famous, called California, the cornucopia of the world. Room for millions of immigrants. 43 million acres of government land untaken. Railroad and private land for 1 million farmers. A climate for health and wealth, free of cyclones and blizzards. So, these early prototypical madmen type people are trying to convince the rest of the country, hey, come out here. This is the time of a great example of boosterism is the Rose Parade, right? Which was established in the early 20th century. And the literal idea was that, hey, while you're freezing in Buffalo or Rochester or, anywhere on the East Coast, we're literally out here having a parade with fresh flowers, strolling our way down Pasadena in January because our climate is so mild and lovely. And again, this was happening throughout the state, but Southern California really was the heart of this boosterism. And there's kind of two pillars to this California dream, this California identity that was sold at this time, and they still carry over somewhat today. The first one is one of its Spanish roots. This is when kind of the mythology around the Spanish roots took place. Kevin Starr writes that the perception of Southern California as an imagined Spanish place, shimmery and romantic, functioned like a pseudo-history upon the region, anchoring it in a mythic time and place that manifested itself in architecture, place names for developing townships, local festivals, and later motion pictures and popular song. So if you're in Southern California, there's so many cities have Spanish names, Spanish identities. Certain cities like Santa Barbara or other cities have the kind of distinct Spanish architecture. That wasn't there from day one in a lot of these places. A lot of it was kind of infused or grafted on to the town and the area later on during this period as part of this kind of celebration of this history, but often a celebration of this history by people who had moved to California during this time. So I think that's interesting as a Southern Californian. The other pillar, in addition to this kind of Spanish Mediterraneanism, is one of agriculture, right? The cornucopia of the world idea is one that gets used a lot. And that's because California agriculture was unique and was extensive and was really effective. Kevin Starr writes that as far as agriculture was concerned, Northern California witnessed the triumph of wheat in the 1870s and 80s when it led the nation in wheat production. And then thanks to the refrigerated rail car, California produce could by the 1890s reach Eastern markets within a week. So thus by the early 1900s, a veritable sea of citrus groves, orange, lemon, and grapefruit ran from the interior counties of Riverside and San Bernardino, where I'm from, shout out, into Los Angeles, headed for the coast. And this led to several famous brands, right? Brands like Sunkist. It was kind of this cooperative of the orange growers in Southern California, created this brand to do the national marketing for their produce. Or similarly, Sun-Maid raisins, which I feed my toddler. Seems like every other day we're having some Sun-Maid raisins. The woman in the field with a bonnet harvesting raisins. So these agricultural brands, the idea of Southern California and all of California as this place of agricultural wealth played into this idea of it being a Mediterranean paradise, a place of health and wealth. And other historians have talked about how the nature of California's um, land and seasons enabled it to have a lot of very highly specialized growing seasons and specialized fruit and vegetables. I think something like 2/3 of the nation's fruit and vegetables come from California, a lot of it from the Central Valley, because we have such a unique climate. So there's two factors to that. One is what I just said, that we could produce a large variety of fruits and vegetables that couldn't be produced in the rest of the country and at a really large scale. So it would become kind of this breadbasket of the nation. The second feature of that, talking about this idea of needing to import labor, which is what this other historian, Carrie McWilliams, talks a lot about, is that because you have these highly concentrated growing seasons that sometimes are even down to just a couple weeks all throughout the state, what resulted was that you needed a highly mobile labor force of a lot of people who could very quickly assemble in one place or another, which then led to some of the workforce dynamics and labor dynamics around California farm laborers that Cesar Chavez and others would highlight later on. But the foundation for that was laid during this period where you had a lot of these agricultural seasons going on. So the California dream at this time was that California is this place that anyone can build a new life. And we had this incredible explosive population growth during this time. The population of California continued from, 2.3 million people in 1910. By 1930, we're up to 5 million people. And then by 1940, we're up to 6.9. Now, of course, for anyone who knows American history, 1900 to World War II, 1940 were not purely peaceful, steady times in America, primarily because of the Great Depression in the 1930s. And California was not immune from the challenges of the Great Depression. And if anything, this California dream, this place of opportunity, welcoming millions of immigrants and people from around the world, between the Great Depression and then World War II, became a place where we opened our arms and then subsequently closed them to different people. Just rattling off a few examples here. It's like the Mexican American population. So between 1920 and 1930, Kevin Starr writes, the Mexican American population in the city of Los Angeles, the single largest minority group in the city, tripled from 33,000 to 97,000. And Los Angeles surpassed San Antonio as the leading Mexican American community in the United States. And it had a Mexican American population larger than all but a few cities in Mexico. Now, then during the 1930s, when the economy tanked and we were in the Great Depression, there's this forcible repatriation of Mexicans, including Mexican Americans, back to Mexico by the federal government. And Kevin Starr describes this as a program that can only be described as ethnic cleansing, where estimates vary wildly, but somewhere from 300,000 to 2 million people were repatriated. Roughly half of them were actually American citizens. At a smaller scale, the African American community at this time, it's known that it's it was small. It was approximately 5,000 people, but it was very prosperous. Los Angeles had the highest rate of homeownership of Black Americans. I think it was around 1930. But then there's a great book, The Coveted West Side, that documents this in great detail. But Los Angeles and California was not immune from things like racial housing covenants and things like that ended up becoming a lot more restrictive about who could live where and leading to a lot of racial animosity later on. Obviously, the Japanese American population, due to internment during World War II, things changed dramatically. Kevin Starr talks about how between 1910 and 1924, roughly 30,000 Japanese women migrated to the United States, most of them for marriages to first-generation immigrants who had come over previously. But then there were several laws passed in 1913 and 1920 that prohibited these first-generation Japanese immigrants from owning property. So there's already a lot of this tension. World War II breaks out, and then 110,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans were behind barbed wire, where they would remain for 3 years or more. And then even for white Americans, if any of you have read Grapes of Wrath in high school, are familiar with the idea of, Okies was the pejorative term for people from the greater Dust Bowl region, but especially those from Oklahoma migrating to the state in pursuit of work. Kevin Starr writes that during the Great Depression, California was flooded with more than 300,000 agricultural workers, not Asians or Mexicans this time, but white Americans from the Great Plains in the Southwest. By the middle of 1934, there were 142 agricultural workers in California for every 100 jobs. Wages plummeted by more than 50%. Indeed, my own family history was one of people moving to California from Kansas. A farm had not gone well, and during the Great Depression, they sold, and they were thankfully able to have enough money to buy a small orange grove in Southern California, where I was from, where my family then lived on my mom's side. But that story was repeated by hundreds of thousands of other people, many of whom were not nearly as fortunate enough to be able to buy land. And there's even stories of the LA sheriff at one point, which is crazy that this was the LA County sheriff, putting up people at the California border, turning them away if they didn't have work guarantees. So trying to enforce interstate migration laws, which was very quickly thrown out by the Supreme Court. But I bring up all these stories, whether it's different minority groups experience or even white Americans coming over from other states, not to try and fixate on racial animosity or conflict, but instead to show that throughout California's history, the California dream has come in waves, waves where that peak with promises of prosperity, with open arms, welcoming in people from around the world, from across the country, and then going down into troughs during times of challenges, during times of depressions, when that dream was no longer a reality and it did not pan out for the people who sought it. In the 30s, as with the rest of the country, were really dicey times in California. There's the famous campaign of Upton Sinclair, this some very quirky socialist author who almost won the governor's race for California. He would write these crazy, long memos and these pamphlets out to people. He had like an almost, I think it was exclusively like fruit and vegetable diet. He suffered a nervous breakdown in between the primary and the general election. He didn't win, but between people like him and these other campaigns for more economic security or these big labor versus capital conflicts where unionized workers, whether it's the dock workers up in San Francisco or the IWW and these other organizations throughout the state, things were really intense and dicey at this time. Now, maybe I'm doing a disservice to this era of California history by focusing on some of the frothier and more conflict-laden themes, but it's also important to note during this time the California dream gained this pillar of identity of being a place of industry. Being a place of industry. So what do I mean by that? It means that the California identity was not just a place of gold rushes, but also a place where there's work being done in a diverse set of industries. So quoting Kevin Starr, between 1907 and 1913, agriculture and related activities, packing, shipping, canning, and food processing continued to offer seasonal and regular employment, as did transportation and shipping via 2 railroads, 2 large streetcar companies, and the 4th busiest port in the nation. With home building constant across 3 decades, there was an expanding job sector in the building trades. The oil industry was producing 106 million barrels a year by 1920. More tires were manufactured in greater Los Angeles than in any place other than Akron, Ohio. More automobiles were being assembled than in any city other than Detroit. The hotel and tourist industry gained even further strength along with 2 new economic sectors, aviation and motion pictures. That was a very LA heavy description, but I think it gives you a sense of this maturing region of it's not just gold and cattle and agriculture. It's all these industries, right? The famous TV show that the Beverly Hillbillies coming out and shooting the ground and oil spouting up. That's what's happening here, right? Oil created really the great industrial infrastructure of Southern California. It was the most productive oil-bearing region at the time for many years. And like Kevin Starr said, aviation and movies as well, right? If you've seen the movie The Aviator with Leonardo DiCaprio, depicting Howard Hughes, the very eccentric entrepreneur of the time who dabbled in both industries, Southern California became the national epicenter of both movie making and aviation, which aviation at the time was arguably the most kind of exciting and forward-thinking industry, one of the future. And in Southern California in particular, would continue to maintain dominance in the aerospace industry post-World War II. But obviously, the motion picture industry and the idea of myth making, of creating these large sets and movies and creating the culture that the rest of the country would consume was added to the idea of the California dream. Okay, I've gone on enough tangents now. I need to keep myself on track. We'll wrap up that chapter of 1900 to World War II, and now we'll turn to post-World War II to roughly 2000. So if I said before that 1900 to World War II was when California was a teenager, when its features started to develop, but they weren't fully, it wasn't fully comfortable in its body yet. It was still kind of limby and gangly and still coming to grips with who it was as a person. This post-war era is when California really steps into maturity, into full-blown adulthood. So that included not only economic development, but also population and kind of its identity as being the center of the place where people went to experience the future of America. So World War II was huge for California in two ways. One was that it stimulated the economy, as California was the center of aerospace and other defense industries. And then two, it kicked off this massive population boom of the post-war era that would persist up until, let's say, the 90s. So, quoting Kevin Starr, the federal government had spent more than $35 billion in California during these war years. And this, in turn, had multiplied the manufacturing economy of the state by a factor of 2.5 and tripled the average personal income. Approximately 1.6 million Americans moved to California, and millions of others had received military training there, passed through, or gone on leave there before being shipped to the Pacific. Sailing out through the Golden Gate, many of them had vowed to return to California and make their lives in California if they survived the conflict. Many kept their word, and the post war era represented a boom that would propel California into becoming, by 1962, the most populous state in the nation. So it's impossible to overemphasize how important this post-war era is for California identity and for cementing the California dream as one of a global hub. California is a global state with two major global cities between San Francisco and Los Angeles. This is when the California that we know today fully came into the picture. Later on, writing, Kevin Starr writes again, the public history of California between 1945 and 1960 is almost exclusively driven by the saga of post-war development. No sooner had California welcomed and housed incoming veterans and their families from the Cold War, or than the Cold War, followed by the Korean War, broke out. The defense-related economy of California, which had been in the process of closing down in the late 1940s, flared once again. Los Angeles County alone found itself by the mid 1950s with more than 40% of all aerospace contracts in the nation. So the economy is humming, and it's not just Southern California. Up north in Silicon Valley, where we think of almost exclusively today being software firms, it didn't come into full fruition and development until a few decades later, but it's starting to pick up around this time, and the defense industry propels it as well. Lockheed Martin, I believe, was the largest employer in Silicon Valley up through the 80s, and a lot of the development of semiconductors and other, hardware that was being developed in the valley at the time was for defense contractors or for defense purposes. So this is when the economy really boomed, when California was not just a place of where people tinkered, but really where they built the future. And at the same time, the lifestyle of Americans was really reflected in California. Thinking about Southern California in particular, this is when the suburban ideal of the post-war era was fully cemented into Americans' minds. We had the first suburbs on the West Coast. We also had we had the first freeway in the nation, and we would quickly expand that model and boom across Southern California, and as aggressively and quickly as possible to accommodate all the new coming people, build out suburban landscape that a lot of the rest of the country would soon imitate in the post-war era. Kevin Starr even talks about the importance of Disneyland at this time on the urban identity. He says that in the case of Disneyland, a permanent exposition and resort assured a newly suburbanizing generation that the values of a more intimate America, small town America, may not be lost, as was being feared in the creation of the suburban developments of the post-war era. So it is just growth, growth, growth is the theme of this time, and that became fused into what the California dream was. California was a place that continued to boom, that continued to grow, and where people from around the country would continue to come to get their taste of the suburban life with a yard and a pool in the backyard and a 3-bedroom, 2-bath ranch home somewhere in the Southern California or San Francisco suburbs. And as part of that growth, the California dream became fused with this idea of upward mobility. This is why things like education and higher education were so important to Californians at this time. Kevin Starr writes how taxpayers were now willing to support the University of California, even though nearly 90% of them would never see their children enrolled in a UC campus. Thus, post-war California conceptualized its place as a higher education utopia in which all Californians would be offered the opportunity to maximize their potential, whatever their individual capacities and talents might be. It was a vast and grand democratic plan, and like the schools, freeways, and housing tracts everywhere under construction in these years, it expressed the optimism of a state that had gone to war and prevailed and would never be the same. In later years, the drama and energy of this period and its aftermath seemed a golden age of consensus and achievement, a founding era in which California fashioned and celebrated itself as an emergent nation state. This is why Kevin Starr, in his book on this post-war era, titles the book Golden Dreams, California in an Age of Abundance. This was California's age of abundance, when there was homes and opportunities and good schools for children, and that's what California represented to the rest of the country. Now, of course, that growth and that explosion and that sense of post-war optimism would not last forever. Kevin Starr later writes that the consensus party of California was being challenged by the party of dissent, talking about the 1960s and 70s. Ever since the 19th century, dissent had been a way of life for what many considered to be the left coast of the nation. Such dissent was focused primarily on industrial and labor-related issues. But in the second half of the 1900s, witnessed an explosion of dissent into politics, feminism, sexuality, and other aspects of personal fulfillment, education, literary and artistic value and practice, drug usage, military service, and corporate culture and control that either originated in California or consolidated itself here and gave the state a reputation for kookiness. Even as critics of California were themselves being transformed by what was going on in the Golden State. Thanks to upheavals in California, the rest of the nation had, by the 21st century, become significantly Californianized. So I use this quote to carry a lot of weight. I'm not going to be able to spend the time diving into all of the nuances of the 60s and the 70s or of, the dissent across a lot of different issues. But that post-war booming era kind of set California on this path of growth. But it would not last. And he talks about a lot of the different social dimensions to that. But another important dimension to that is the anti-growth movement that developed and gained steam in the 70s and 80s, pushing back against this sense that we were paving over paradise, that we were growing too quickly, and that California's continued growth threatened the quality of life for the people who were already here. If you listen to any of my other episodes, that with Nolan Gray or Virginia Postrel or Bill Fulton, we talk a lot about the anti-growth movement and its implications for us as a state today, particularly around housing. And it's that movement that leads us to where we are today. The state has represented, for so many people, for so many generations, for so long, it has stood as the place of opportunity, of transformation, of growth, of the place where you come and you can take part in the future, where you can see it being built and developed, and that you yourself can have better opportunity. But that is no longer true. There's a lot of different stats you can point to. I don't want to bore you with a bunch of stats, but take, for instance, the fact that California, when you adjust for cost of living, leads the nation in poverty rate. Right? Take the fact that California during COVID stopped growing for the first time. I'll bring up a chart of California's growth patterns over its history. But California, you can see its incredible growth post 1940, but it stopped growing. And it's funny because we live in this duality as a state where we still are the place of innovation, right? If you want to see the future in America, you go to Silicon Valley and you see what it looks like. But outside of the corporate hallways, the dream very much feels broken. Right? We're a state that historically was able to build great works like the California Aqueduct or the higher education system or the most advanced freeway system in the nation, yet we can't build high-speed rail. Also, for a state that was defined by optimism and a sense of opportunity about what the future could be, of dynamism, that has largely faltered. And a lot of Californians I speak to, particularly people my age, I'm 31, it's more so pessimism or cynicism. Should I consider leaving the state or, moving inland or moving elsewhere so that I can afford to live? This is especially true for the working class, and you can see it on all the demographic numbers around who leaves the state and who comes in. We're experiencing this de facto gentrification of the state just because of the fact that the only people who move in are the people who are high income earners who can afford to live in our absurd housing market. And that the people leaving predominantly, and this has been true for a long time, it's those who are working class, because working class people who just cannot afford to live in California anymore. This tension between the promise, the marketed version of what the state is, of this land of opportunity, and the reality on the ground. Right? There's Kevin Starr, when he's summarizing Joan Didion's writing, he says that Didion more than implied that both her personal California, in terms of the myths she had observed as a child, in the larger California experiment contained what she believed to be a crippling level of deceit and self-deception. That in some ways, California had somewhat lied to itself of promising that we are the state of opportunity, of growth, but that in making the promises of being the frontier of the frontier of the world, right, being the frontier of America, that we couldn't live up to the expectations that we laid for ourselves. And here's this lengthy quote I'm going to read from Kevin Starr. I adjust the numbers so that they're more accurate for our economy today. But he writes about this very tension in his toward the end of his history. He says that there's always been something slightly bipolar about California. It was either utopia or dystopia, a dream or a nightmare, a hope or a broken promise, and too infrequently anything in between. A society of great promise with a $4 trillion economy, making it the fourth largest on the planet. The world was still rushing in, legally and illegally, as it turns out, not to escape reality in California, to bask in the unearned increment, but to struggle competitively in a society that had only begun to internalize the myth of itself. California was a promise, but is also a struggle for redemption in the face of failure. Later on, he writes, the common complaint that California had been hyped beyond recognition. That for all its media-driven pretenses to glitz and glamour, California was, all things considered, just another American place, sometimes even worse than that. So that's where we are today. Is California still spectacular? Is it still a place of unique opportunity and upside? Or is it just another American place? Or maybe even worse than that? That's the question that Kevin Starr leaves us with, that I am constantly wrestling with, and that all Californians are having to think about. I don't have a clear prescription of what progress looks like. I don't have a 5-point plan of here's what we need to do as Californians to get back on track. You know, we talk about this in some of our different conversations and episodes, how things like housing affordability, how other cultural elements are critical for getting the state back to where it can be a place of dynamism once again, or even more so than it is today. I think that fundamental question of is California just another American place is the one that we should be thinking about and asking ourselves and questioning, what do we want the state to be in the future? Right, like I said, we lead the nation in poverty. We have all these challenges. We're also going to be getting older as a state and as the rest of the country. And I think about that a lot of, are we at a place and will we be at a place where we're willing to invest in and sacrifice for the future of the state, even if an increasing share of the state's population will not be around to reap the rewards of that effort? I personally root for dynamism. Maybe it's because I'm young, but even more so, it's because of I believe that the world is better off when California is at its best, that America is better off when California is at its best, that many of our best ideas have come from California, that our sense of what the future can be is shaped by California and our culture. And I think that there's something fundamentally good about having a future that you believe in, that you dream about. I personally feel that when a society stops believing that the future can be better than what we have today, that society can become more zero sum. It can become more full of conflict. But rather, that when you're united in a vision of a brighter future, of a better tomorrow, that people are more willing and able to sacrifice for the pursuit of the greater good. So I don't have a super cheery note to end on, rather just ending on this question that I've been wrestling with, and leaving it with you, and asking what things that you think about when you think about this question of what will define California's future. Because I think more than anything, what's clear to me after thinking about the state's history is that what got us here today will not get us where we're hoping to go. That this model of cheap land and booming infrastructure and growing industry, it's not the days of easy growth are over in the state, but that does not mean that the days of growth and opportunity are over. I'll end on this. It's easy to bag on California, to complain about California, but the truth is that even where we are today, even for all of the challenges that we face, we still are the envy of the world. That our companies, that our industry, that our dynamic, educated population, we are still a forward-looking people pushing the boundaries of what's possible. And even if we are failing to fully live up to our ideals as a state, we still have the core pillars of a society that believes that tomorrow can be better. We are a place that still dreams. And so even if we've fallen short of our ideals, I think that still gives me a lot of hope. So anyways, I feel like I'm getting really preachy here at the end. I feel like I'm just kind of shooting from the hip on a lot of different things that have been on my chest or things that I'm thinking about as I read my book. So I'm going to wrap up to spare you and to save myself before jumping off the deep end here. But um, I really enjoyed this. I really enjoyed talking about where the state has gone and where it can go, because that breathes a lot of life into my spirit. And I think like I said at the very beginning, we need an evolution, a new picture of the California dream. And the first step to doing that is just to acknowledging that where we are, where we're falling short, and what we hope for from the future. So my goal with this podcast, with everything that I do, is to infuse a sense of possibility into how you all think about California. So thank you for listening. As always, I love to hear your thoughts. This is a very different episode. It's somewhat personal, it's somewhat long, winding, and meandering of me digging into some of these historical themes. And like I said, I left a lot on the table. So if there's ever specific eras of California history that you find interesting, that you'd want me to dig into in greater detail and to think about their implications for the future of the state, I'd love to do that. I try and spare getting too historical on too many things, but I will leave you with that. And here's to California's future.
What?